Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We finished the paragraph on page 1352. So now we've established how ner, the meaning of a ner, a candle, which of course illuminates, that's what a candle does, is associated both with the shamas, souls, ner Hashem nishmas adam. The flame of Hashem, of God, is the soul of a human being, and also associated with a mitzvah, ner mitzvah. That a mitzvah is also compared, the flame, the candle of a mitzvah. And the Rebbe Rashab, in two separate paragraphs, explained ner neshama on page 1350 and 1351, and ner mitzvah in 1351 and 1352. And briefly, a ner is made up of three components. There's the wick, there's the shemen, the fuel, and there's the fire, the flame that it creates, the light that it generates. What is it in the neshama? The neshama is the wick, is the interface between the shemen, which is the animal souls, particularly the wisdom of the animal soul. So it is in a potential state. It exists concealed, like when you look at oil, it's a physical matter. But if you don't ignite it, it just remains in that dormant state. So a wick, which is the nefesh alekis, as it manifests within the body and the animal soul as it comes down below, it has that power to ignite, because the nefesh alekis, through contemplation and emotional stimulation of love and reverence of God, in turn ignites the shemen, producing a fire that is consuming the animal soul. Instead of it focusing on its own needs, it's now directed towards, through the psila, through the wick of the divine soul within it, creating the Eish Eliki. Similarly, a mitzvah has also three components. There's the will of God as it manifests in the physical world, like the wool of tzitzis, or the cloth, or the parchment or leather of tefillin. So it's the Ratzon Elyon as it manifests in the physical world. That's the psila, the mitzvah. And what does it do? It takes the physicality of existence, which is the shemen, similar to what we said before about the animal soul, the same idea, the human being, the world, and indeed also the animal soul, and it transforms it into a mitzvah of Hashem, into a generating in turn oir. And what is oir? The divine light of Torah, which is a oir atzmi. It's not an oir that's coming from existence, in other words, generated from the material world. It's a er atzmi, like you said, of atzmus ein sof, er ein sof, the primis v'atzmis. That is the er Torah. But how is the er Torah manifest? Not just in a pure, unadulterated light. It's nechas. It holds on to, and in the psila of the mitzvahs, because the mitzvahs is the primary function, or they said kol ha'Torah shel v'neinu is ikram v'yesodin hu ba'mitzvahs. So the mitzvah is like the wick, that connects the Eir Torah, which is Eir Atzmi, Ima Adam Va'elam, and also with the animal soul, and the animal soul and all the things are all included in Eir Torah. And actually, I checked in Torah Eir, as I said, I would check in the Maimer, Mika Hashem Elokeinu Magbi. Indeed, the Loshin, Mehafuch, El Hafuch, and a few other of the expressions here are word for word from Torah Eir of the Alter Rebbe in Chanukah, Maimorim of Chanukah. And that's where he says it transforms the Seichel HaTivi, the natural mind, which is the domain of the animal soul, Seichel HaNushi, which is understood to a Seichel of Chochmas HaTeirah and Chochmas Elikis. So the animal soul on its own has intelligence, but the intelligence can be focused on its own survival or on understanding science and the world around it. But when the mitzvah, which is the wick, what it does, it channels the fuel. It channels the animal soul and its mind to become fuel that fuels what? The Torah. So when a person explains, for example, understands with the Seichel HaNefesh HaBamis, or the Seichel Tivi, with our natural mind, we understand the concept in Torah. What are we doing? We're essentially elevating the fuel, the shemen, through the wick of the mitzvah into the Eir Torah, like you said, Eir Torah, Chochmas HaTorah, which is higher than just regular wisdom. It's the wisdom, that unknowable wisdom of the divine. So there you have it. So essentially, to put it in the language that we learned earlier, that Neir captures the concept how to turn the material world and the human being and the animal soul into a keli telekus. That's what a Neir is. On its own, the material world has divine energy within it, but it's concealed, as we learned at length earlier. When you do a mitzvah, we learn that mitzvahs are kelim, and neshama is connected to kelim. So the neshama doing a mitzvah in this world essentially turns the world into a divine flame, the flame of Neir Hashem Nishmas Neir Mitzvah, which manifests the Torah Eir, the Eir of Torah. But this is all through the kelim of turning the world into kelim. Torah, we learned earlier, and also even here he said it more or less. Torah on its own is the other way around. It's mamayla lamata. It's air coming into kelim. Is the air coming from the ayin to the yesh. Here is the yesh to the ayin. He didn't get into it. It's mamata lamayla lamata, but as I explained, most likely this is like an interface in between Neir Mitzvah and the Neir of the neshama. Because real mamata lamayla is tshuva, is when a person is in the darkest state, and that comes and is elevated from the bottom up. But you can also say that when you do a mitzvah, it's also mamata lamayla. So in a way, you could say tefillah, pure prayer, is completely from the bottom up. A mitzvah, neshamas, is bottom up, but also it has a gili, the gili of the mitzvah, or the gili of the neshama. So there's a neir involved in it. But Torah would be in its purest form. So you have really like three levels in a way, you can say. He doesn't say it explicitly, but that's what appears to me. And as I said, I'm doing more speculating than usual because Ayin Beis is not going to be finished. So it's good to just lay it out as much as possible. Okay. With that said, let's continue on. A new paragraph on page 1352. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com, and here we go. The nidali levayir, I mean, not nun lamed can be v'nida lemer, but since he says levayir inyan, nida lemer levayir inyan, you could say nida lemer. Nida is already the Rebbe Rashav is saying it appears. Sometimes we say nida li, it appears to me. Here I'm not sure whether the lamed is li or nida lemer levayir. Either way works. But bottom line is, this is definitely Rebbe Rashab's addition. Nida, sometimes it says v'yesh lemer. And we can say, Nida Lemer is a little more personal in the way. Nida Lemer appears that we can say, Levayda Inyan, I would say Nida Li Levayda Inyan to explain the Inyan, Al Pimasha Kosev Mokamach. So he's now going to explain this idea, which is based on the Torah as I said, in Chanukah Magbil Shevas, Mika Hashem Elokeinu, that Maimer, according to what it says elsewhere. He's going to explain it now. This is clearly the Rebbe Rashab's addition and explanation. Be'inyan api mashakos mokamach, according to what it's explained elsewhere in the inyan of Eir Hariyah. So he's going to now introduce another form of Eir Hariyah, the light of vision. So vision also is associated with light. Besides the fact that we see things, so it's a form of revelation of something visible. There's also Eir. Eir enters into the eye, and that's what allows us to see things. So he says like this: the ima yeshe bechinas Eir, even though the Eir Ariyah, the light that comes, the light that's associated with vision and sight, is a level of Eir. V'yesh deya. We learned earlier that there are different opinions how exactly vision works. Is it that the light of the eye takes like a snapshot of the object? Or is the object reflecting light that's entering into the eye? So it says, there's an opinion that the way we see things is through the eye, has sparks, so to speak. Not actual sparks that you can see, but it gives off a light that come from the light from the eye that allows one to see things. in volume 1 on page 543. Let me look at it already since I have it in front of me. Tavkuf Mem Gimel. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, there are two opinions. Day Aleph, sheyetzim mitzutz er ma'ayin harirei etzem amahus. That's one opinion. So there's so-called like light beams, or light rays is a better way to put it. Waves, light rays or waves that emerge from the eye and magim el hageshem. V'r'yesivim kema shu sham. And they see the Geshem and see it as it is in its place. I'm reading from page 543 in volume 1. So they actually see the physical object the way it is. But obviously it's a reflection because this sight does not hold on to the object. It's not like touching it, but it's seeing the actual object. The second is like a snapshot. That which is the object that's being seen is like the eye is taking it creates an image in the eye. And he goes into details of how exactly the eye works. Similar to like a mirror image, he calls it. And according to that, he's only seeing a snapshot of it, not the actual thing. Okay. So he's going back here. So even though Hari is saying is light, and there's an opinion that it's like the light of the eye, that coming from the eye is able to see the images around it. Nevertheless, he can't call it er atzmi. Like the light of the sun or the light of a flame or a candle. And he's going to explain why in a moment. And it's also not like the shining of a brilliant stone. Like there are stones that glimmer, like a diamond, or other stones that you can see. They give off a type of light. They reflect light. They give off light. That's what we call them, brilliant stones, a brilliant gem or something like that. Why is it not a er atzmi, the light of the eye that we see? Shari er hashemesh u er hameres hacheshach. Er hashemesh, the sunlight, is actually a force of light that radiates the darkness. So when there's a dark night and the sun begins to rise, the sun shines and illuminates darkness. Umashameir ein rak mitzad habihira shalei levad. And the illumination or the radiance of the sun is not just because it's a radiant object. Because the light that comes due to its radiance, that would be, for example, a star. A star is a radiant object, and you see it shining even in the dark night. But it doesn't illuminate the earth. All it is, it's a radiant body, and therefore the darkness does not darken it or conceal it. Because it's a radiant object. And due to that, and that's why it also radiates and illuminates in its place, in its own location. In other words, the star does radiate, but not the earth. Just to give that as an example. He's going to actually not give the example of a star. He's going to give the example of a shining object, a shiny object. That we just mentioned. Like a shiny stone. By night, you can also see it. You can see certain things glow at night. Due to the intensity or the power of its of its brightness, of its radiance. So it's boher. It's radiant as in the fact that it glows, but to say that it illuminates, no. It glows in its own location. Yes, close by, perhaps it sheds some light, but to say that it pierces the darkness, illuminates darkness like the sunlight, no. By contrast, however, the light of the sun, who Eir HaMeir, is also Eir HaMeir. So there's Eir Boher, which means a radiant object, an object that has radiant light, and there's Eir Meir, an illuminating light. The Levada Behira Shabai, that besides, in addition to the fact that the sun is also a radiant object, the sun is a powerful, it itself is a bright. So in addition, besides the fact that it's a radiant body, and darkness does not darken it, does not conceal it, how do you make it a? That's what makes it atzmi. It also overpowers and dispels darkness and radiates and illuminates the darkness. Why is that due? That is due to the fact because the shemesh is a moyer be'etzem. God created it as a force that gives off light, a moyer be'etzem, fundamental moyer, a luminary, and the light and the reflection that extends from the sun, who atzmi, is a core light. In other words, it's not just that it has light, but it's a core light, means it generates light. Alkenu meir, and that's why it illuminates. Omnam eir hariyah. Now he's going back to the fact that the sight, the power of sight in the eye, eir hariyah, however, ena eir hameir es hacheshach. That is not a light that radiates and illuminates darkness. V'harayah, and the proof of that is very obvious. In a place of darkness, you can't see. If you don't have a light that's shining, besides the eye. So the truth is, the eye does have an element of light, but only when it's bright. It's a bright area. In daylight, we can see. In an illuminated room, you can see. But to say that the light of vision, it itself illuminates. In other words, the eyes themselves give off light like flashlights. That's not the case. So there's oir connected to vision, obviously, because it's seeing things. Like, for example, you don't say there's oir hashmiyah. There's no light when it comes to hearing something. And seeing, so for example, if a person is in a bright room or in the middle of daylight, if their eyes are closed, they also don't see. So you need to have some type of translucent eye to be able to see. But to say that the eye gives off light and illuminates, that's not the case. Like we see in a dark area that you can't see. V'gam eina eir boher. And the truth is also not the first level. It's not like a bright stone, like a glowing stone either. Shari eina nira b'layla. If you look at a person by night, you're not going to see his eyes glowing. You'll maybe see a cat has eyes that maybe glow. But if you look, it's not going to be like the whole person will be shrouded in darkness. So if the eyes, for example, remain glowing even in the dark, you could at least say it's not like a sun, but it's at least like an even toiv boher, like a glowing stone. It's not that either. So in truth is, we have here several levels. We have the sun, which is etzem ha'oyer or ner. They give off light in addition to being bright themselves. You have an even, a glowing stone that doesn't give off light, but it shines, it's glowing. And then you have the eyes, also a form of oyer, but it's an oyer that doesn't shine and doesn't give off and does not illuminate darkness. So what kind of oyer is it? That you see when there's a place where it's illuminated, the vision allows you to see that which is in that room or that area, mokim. Okay, we still have to see where he's going with this and how this explains what we're learning. But clearly, if you think about it, before we even continue, you see here that Rebbe Rashab is now further dissecting the process of transforming darkness to light. And we're going to be learning there's many ways, many levels of doing it. The highest level of Oyer is going to be Oyer Atzmi, all the way up to before the tzimtzum and the highest levels of Oir. But there's lower levels of Oir as they go into existence, like Ner Mitzvah, Ner of Neshama, and even lower levels. And we'll soon see how he ties it all together. But it's going to come down to basically different levels of how we bring Oir into our existence, into life. But I'll stop here before I continue. Any questions so far?
I understand how does the stone illuminate itself unless like it's heated up or something?
There's a thing called a bright stone. I don't know how, it just is.
I never heard.
For example, a regular stone, like if you ever walk in the forest, you'll see there are black stones, there's stones you don't see, and there's stones that have some form of glow. It's usually a precious stone has a glow of its own.
You can take a diamond in a black room and you won't see it at all. I don't understand unless
there
you heat
are
it
other
up.
stones you do see. There are other stones. I just look it up on Google. There are stones that have a glow of their own. Some are greenish, some are blue, some are a little white. I don't know about a diamond. Not sure whether a diamond gives off its own light, if it has any glow in a dark place. But there are definitely stones that do have a glow to them. They're called something. There's a certain name they have.
A radioactive one, I don't.
Anyway, I would just simply do a search and look around. Stones that have glowing stones, they're called.
By Noach, it said, some say it was he brought in a stone.
It was a stone that gave off, yeah. But there, yeah, that's correct. But fine, we don't need, but I'm talking about even scientifically, even today. Just look it up. I mean, it's no big thing. Just search.
By the stars, you could see that there is a glow. They don't lighting up, but you see the glow.
We're not talking about a star. A star is like a sun. The star is not a good example here. We need an Evan Tave.
See, even the sun or a star, there's some sort of combustion going on. There's actually a fire.
Glowing stones. That's all. I mean, you're arguing with the fact there are glowing stones.
And even the sun or a star, if there wasn't like a fire going on or some sort of combustion or something, that you wouldn't see that either. If it was just an inert rock that big, it's something. I don't know.
Okay, here we go. In general, glow stones are powered by photoluminescent glow pigment, otherwise known as strontium aluminate, a non-radioactive rare earth element. The glow pigment is mixed into either resin or glass to create a glow stone. There are glowing stones. I mean, it's a fact. It's not, you don't need a munah here.
Okay, it's a very rare
thing. You don't need faith.
Just look it up. I think
there's a thing called a glowing stone.
I think even more than a star.
What are we talking about?
We're arguing the illumination of a fire.
If you told me, if you told me you Googled it and looked it up and said there's no such thing in existence, we would then have to dig deeper. There is such a thing. I know it as a fact. I've seen it. There is a stone that glows. Anyway, so bottom line is there's a sunlight. He also said, Neir, we'll get back to a candle. There's a stone that glows, which is a lower level. And then there's the Oir Hariyah, the light and of vision and sight, which does not glow and also does not give off light that illuminates the dark. That's what he said, right? Any other questions? If you want to know the names of stones that glow, calcite, fluorite, selenite, chalcedony, and corundum are just several of them. Limestone, marble can also glow at times. Granite, yeah, a bunch of list of different stones that glow.
Wow.
It doesn't mention diamonds, so maybe that's correct. Diamond does not glow. Yeah. It's a whole thing. It just, I did one search, glowing stones. It gave me 1,000 entries here. Okay. But we still have to figure out what, he still didn't explain how it's relevant to our discussion. We'll soon see. And the inyan of this is as follows. He's introducing now in light itself, there's a masculine dimension and there's a feminine dimension. That you never heard yet, probably, right? That's a form of mashpia, one that gives off, that exudes, that transmits mitzad atzmei on its own. In other words, it has that power to give off like a mashpia. It has within its own power, not an outside force, but within its own power, to radiate, illuminate, a light and a reflection that shines, a shining light and reflection. That's like the light of the sun, and the light of a candle. The Torah calls Shemesh is called a luminary, not just oir. God created it that be'etzem, its fundamental set, it's not like just a reflects light or a channels light. It was created to be a luminary, a source of light. Umafil kol b'chinas er v'ziv, and it affects and causes all the forms of light and reflection that we experience. That's what the sun's purpose is. The chena eish, same with fire. Nikra moed. Eish is also called a moed, a luminary. And he's explaining, what does he mean by eish? I mean, obviously, eish can be any fire. But there's the eish HaYesedi, according to the Ramban. This brings it often, we learned it earlier. That eish HaYesedi, which is the core element of fire, God created eish ruach mayim offer. But in the Yesedis, it's not necessarily physical fire. It's the archetype of fire. Hu kamoy etzem ha'ir. Eish HaYesedi is like the core light. That's why it's called chashach. We learned earlier, the eish HaYesedi is not necessarily bright that it shines. It's the source of light, but it itself can be in a state of darkness. So it's not like the sun. The sun is a er atzmi that gives off light, and it itself is bright. He's bringing out the eish HaYesedi is the root, the source of light of fire, but it itself can be dark because it's not expressed fire. It's similar to like a flintstone. A flintstone can give off sparks, and the sparks originate from within the stone, but the stone itself, there's no spark. You don't see a spark, you don't feel a spark. You could put the stone in water, it won't extinguish the potential of giving off sparks, just as an example. It's not exact example, it's just like an example. So now he gave another example of something the opposite. With a glowing stone, it glows, but it doesn't illuminate. Here, something doesn't glow, but it can be the source of fire. It is the source of fire. And because it's a mashpia, he's going back now to the er atzmi. So like the sunlight or fire, but they both radiate also when it's dark, because they're fundamental light. It's not just that they are bright. They have the power to give off light and illuminate. It's very different than something that's just bright. That's chura. That's the level of tchar, the mashpia, the masculine dimension. Now remember here, when we say masculine, feminine, we don't mean man and woman. We mean mashpia and makam, two different types of energy. One is an exuding energy, and one is actually an absorbing energy, an intimate energy. Now he's going to go to the in the level of nukva. So we said in there's two types of one that gives off, and one, as we're going to say now, nukva, and the feminine aspect. The second dimension in light, that means something that doesn't have its power on its own to give off and exude and shine and give and exude with light. But rather, in this case, when it receives within itself, it absorbs and receives a reflection of light, then that too radiates. So why is it called oir? Because there are things that don't reflect light. For example, the moon reflects light. There are many objects in this outer space, for instance, like meteors, meteorites, asteroids, that don't reflect the sun. They can remain completely dark, like a black stone, like a dark stone. So the moon is true. The moon doesn't give off its own light, but when it receives light, then you see light. And that's why the moon shines. It's a different type of light, but it shines. That's Oyer HaMakabel, that's the Oyer of Nukva. U'kamoy derech mashal, like for example, b'hashpos ha'seichel min ha'mashpia el ha'makabel. The transmission of intelligence from a teacher to a student, from a transmitter to a recipient. The recipient, the student, also has the light of seichel. We're not talking about it. A teacher can, for example, convey intelligence to a stone or to a piece of wood. So the makabel also has seichel. But his seichel does not radiate and come alive. Not that he doesn't have any seichel, but the seichel is being taught until it receives from his mashpia. You don't see it illuminate. You don't see it bright. You don't see it. It's not visible. So the seichel is there. He has seichel, but to stimulate that seichel, the mashpia must stimulate that seichel. Now, just to qualify, obviously that doesn't mean that if there's no teacher, he doesn't have any visible seichel. He's obviously talking about the seichel the teacher is teaching him. So this oyer of the mashpia, chidush, let's say, an innovation, is coming from the mashpia. The makabel has the capacity to understand it, but he doesn't yet consciously understand it until the teacher teaches it to him. That's the example he's using for the oyer makabel, the oyer of nukva. By limud min hamashpia yaskil haskolas ba'atzmei. And after and through learning from his mashpia, from his teacher, from the transmitter, then yaskol haskolas ba'atzmei, he can also then conceive of ideas on his own. V'gam yashpia el azulas, and he too can then transmit and teach another. We're talking about the student now. Afal pi she'ein sichla shel mashpia meir alav. Even though the seichel of the mashpia is not there to radiate over him. In other words, even when he's not in the presence of his teacher, he can still teach. V'adarabah, what does that show? That he has oyer. So initially, he needed to receive from his teacher. That in turn stimulated and generated his capacity to have oyer. And not only that, but the oyer that he could also give to another. V'adarabah. On the contrary, kol ma sheyisrach katalmid min harav, the farther the student distances himself from his teacher, yochel yeser lashpia, the more he's able to transmit. Because when he's in the presence of his teacher, he's going to be either humbled or overwhelmed or just whatever the reason is. It's like the moon right near the sun is not going to shine. But when it's further apart, that's when it will give off its own light. Like we see this in the masculine and feminine. A woman has within herself the power to give birth and to conceive. When a woman will conceive and give birth, so we know see from that in other words, she's not just a carrier of someone else's power to give birth. She herself has the power to give birth and conceive because she carries an egg. That, however, and yet she won't conceive and won't give birth without the seed, that the tchar, the ashba, that comes from the male. So she has everything she needs to give birth. Obviously, a zachar can't either give birth on his own. For sure not. He doesn't have that capacity. So you see here, what stimulates her power to give birth, like the makabel we talked about, is the mashpia. Like the power of vegetation, of growth in the earth. So we know the earth has the power to give birth, to grow things. Where does that power come from? The earth itself has that power. The sky doesn't have that power. a plain air, in the middle of the air, it doesn't have the power to make things grow. But nevertheless, you need a mashpia to stimulate that power of growth within the earth. Rak, shezai dashpa sakshamim. It's when it rains, the ashpa of the rainfall. The pasuk says in Bereshit is when the rain will fall, and the rain will cause the earth to start giving off its growth to grow. If it doesn't rain, the earth can get parched and arid, and will be just like a desert, even though earth has the power to have things grow. So you need a mashpia to stimulate the power, but it's not that the water, the rain, or the seeds are causing the growth. The growth is from the earth. You take the same rain and seeds and put them on a table, nothing will happen. They'll ultimately, it'll be wet, and the seeds will ultimately deteriorate. Now he goes back to Oir. The Kamoi Kain, similarly, the Levona, same thing, similarly as with the moon. The Sira Lesla Megamal Klum. The moon has no light of its own. Like we said till now, it's not Oir, like he said, Oir that's mashpia, Oir that has Oir mitzad atzmei. It does not have any light on its own. It has nothing of its own. So therefore, the light that the Shem'ira Lavona that radiates the moon, that illuminates the moon, is not mitzad atzma. It's not coming from the moon on its own, because on its own it has nothing of its own. And yet we cannot say she'ein lo er klal, that has no light at all. The next page, 1353. Because first of all, the Torah itself calls it the name of a moed. It says, that God created the great luminary and the small luminary. So we see the Levana is called a moed. So how do we reconcile that? On one hand, you're saying it has nothing of its own, and the Eid is also not coming from itself, and yet you call it a moed. Acha kavana. And then, and here the Torah calls it a moed. Acha kavana. However, the intention here is, rather, acha kavana b'masha omer leslo megamal klum. The intention, the meaning of when we say it has nothing of its own, hainu she'ein lo oira mispashet lahoyer. It doesn't have on its own the power to radiate. It has the power, like we said, the woman's power to give birth, the earth's power to let things grow. It definitely has it. The student that has seichel on his own is just it's not been triggered. You need a catalyst. So it doesn't have a spashet lahoyer, an earth that will radiate on its own. The ima yesu b'chinas moed, even though it's called, it's a level of a luminary, ein b'yacholta lahoyer ma'atzma. It does not, it can not capable of radiating on its own. Only when it receives the light of the sun, similar to the examples we gave, that stimulates. So the moon is not just a mirror. The moon has oir, but for the oir to be illuminated, for the oir to be effective and expressive, it doesn't happen until it receives from the light of the sun. That in turn it stimulates and causes it to radiate with the oil that it has on its own. So it's not just like a funnel. A mirror, for example, doesn't have any light of its own. Even when it's reflecting light, the mirror is just a reflector. Whereas the moon has the power of light, but like the power of intelligence in the student or the power of birth in the woman, it's there, but it needs a catalyst, something from outside, in this case, the sun, to get it going, so to speak. And then the moon gives off the inner light that it has on its own. So lesla megamo klum, when you say nothing of its own, meaning nothing of its own to give off, nothing to be mashpia until it receives, and then it can give off that light. That's a deeper interpretation of what you usually hear about the Erev Makabel. Okay. So now this is like a shtickle, you could say a chiddush if you wish. Because now he adds in the parentheses, v'yesh b'zeh gam eir hashemesh. in the light of the moon, it has also an additional element. Not only its own light, it also has the light of the sun that it's reflecting. I think what he means to say that even though the sun's light is within the moon, but it's changed, becomes like the light of the moon, not like the light of the sun. I mean, first I thought he means it changes and it's no longer like but he doesn't say that. He says so my thinking is that it means like the light of the sun that's within the moon also gets transformed to become the personality of the light of the sun. In other words, the personality of the light of the moon, rather. Like, for example, when a student receives the idea from his teacher, once it's within the student, it's in the shape and the image of the student's mind, not the teacher. So it's all being channeled now through the student. That's what he's saying here. Okay. V'hainu. I'll stop in a minute. We'll take questions, or if you want. V'hainu, which this means this is the meaning of er makabel. So er makabel is not, as some would understand it, that it's just receiving. You're giving and I'm receiving. No, it also there's er. That's why it's called er makabel. It doesn't have the power to generate and reveal light on its own, but it's also an er, so it receives, and that stimulates, triggers the light that it has within. So there we see that Oyer has both Char and Nukva, Mashpia and Makabel in Oyer itself. And that's why it doesn't radiate on its own without that without that trigger, without that catalyst. Okay. Now I see comes a parenthesis, which is not so short. Where does it go till? Yeah, it's a good 10 lines. Let me stop here. Anybody, I want to ask any questions, any comments, any thoughts? Oops. Any comment? No questions? Okay. So before we read the parentheses, let me just make something very clear. I think it's important to know. Because remember, all these are physical examples and physical manifestations. In the parentheses, we're going to learn what it is in Ruchnius Lamaila. And I want to just say it before we read it inside, because it's very important to understand the context here. And we initially, when we think of light, let's say the sun, we think of the sun as being a very powerful body of light that also generates light and gives off light and illuminates the earth. And therefore we have a day and night. We have daylight, sunlight, due to the sunlight. But it's a little deeper than that. When we say that something is a er atzmi, it means, yes, it gives off light, but it itself is a source of light. So remember, before we learned about the Eish HaYesedi, may not be bright, you may not see it, but it could be, so it's not like the sun you see, the sun has light within it, and it gives off light. So when you talk about the sun and the moon, you could say the following. The moon also has light within, but it's not giving off light until it's triggered by the catalyst of the sun. The sun itself gives off light, but also has be'etzem its light. But when you think about it above, the Eibishter God, is God a body called light? No. The Eibishter is beyond light and beyond darkness, beyond mashpia, beyond mekabel. And he has two tracks, as we're going to learn shortly. The track to reveal, and the power to conceal. So the power to conceal is not necessarily darkness. The power to conceal is simply another power. So we actually have two tracks in that sense. So why am I saying this? Because I think it's going to be critical. I'm going to learn now that there's a difference between a moyer and oyer. You can have light, for example, we talked before light. You can, for example, let me just think of an example. Well, we talked about a bright stone, a glowing stone. But I want to think of another example. I'm trying to find an example of something that's light. Sunlight. Sunlight is a good example. Even though the sunlight illuminates, but the sunlight needs to have a sun that gives it light. Sunlight itself doesn't generate light. It's just a channel for the sun. So when the sunlight reaches Earth, you don't have the actual sun. The etzem hamoyer is the sun. The sun gives off light, and the light reaches Earth. But the sunlight itself, if you remove the sun, the light of the sun doesn't have any power of its own. It's just an extension of light. That's oyer, not moyer. Moyer is a source of light, which also has light, but it's also the source of light. So now you'll see, I'll read the parentheses. I see time is limited here. So I'll just read it quickly, at least the first lines. So he says like this, V'nimtza, I'm reading on the 6th line, top of page 1353. V'nimtza, what we derive from this, Mashihi b'chinas moyer u b'chinas atzmi. Lei b'chinas oyer. Because now he's still trying to explain, so why is the Levana, the moon, called a moyer? Okay, we understand that it has element of light within it, like a student has seichel. But a moyer would indicate that it's a source of light. And we know that the source of the moonlight is the sun. So yes, the sun is the catalyst that triggers the essential light that's within the moon that the moon doesn't have. Well, why is the moon called a moyer? He says the reason is because it's a moyer because it's an atzmi. Moyer means an atzmi, a core entity. But so to say that the moon is not a luminary, it is a luminary. However, it's not the level of revealed light. It's a luminary in a different way. We'll soon explain what that different way is. For it to actually give off light, it needs the sun, the mashpia. Because the sun is not just a source of light, it's also an illuminator. Whereas in the moon, it's only an asmi, not oyer. Not like the sun should be. With the shemesh, you have both elements. Being that it's a luminary, it's also a luminary that gives off light. It's a state of light. The inyan of the sun is to radiate with revealed light. We know the pasuk says that the moon was also created to give off light, to radiate. He's asking a question. Because what it says, that Eibishter placed these two luminaries in the sky, in the heaven, refers to both of them, sun and moon. So why are you telling me the Levana doesn't radiate? Additionally, you just said that the shemesh is a moyer that gives oyer. But the shemesh also has an element of atzmi, of a moyer, which is more than just light. It also has oyer, but it also has moyer. Umashakosov lahoyer hainu al yedei ha'oyer. Ukamashakosov mokamacher. So what does it mean that lahoyer ala oretz? Lahoyer means that the moyer is a moyer. Lahoyer means that through through the oyer of the shemesh, that's how it radiates. Nevertheless, it's not that concealed in the sun. Okay, this needs explanation, which I have to go over again. I don't think I have right now the time to review in detail. So I'm going to stop here in the middle of the parentheses. But essentially, he's going to be explaining the difference between the two types of luminaries, and that even the sun has an etzem, even though it also has the power to radiate. The moon has etzem and doesn't have the power to radiate unless something stimulates it. And therefore, they're both called moyer because there's two different ways of giving off. And he's going to explain what those two are, Lamaila, the koyach hagili and the koyach ha'elam. But I'd rather leave that for tomorrow because it needs a lot more elaboration in this discussion here.
The moon is also called a Moer HaGodol, as Shnei HaMeoros HaGdolim.
Yeah, but he's not. You see clearly he's avoiding talking about that here because here he's talking after the Miyut HaLavona. Or you could say even before the Miyut HaLavona, there's the element that it does say a Samoyer HaGodol, a Samoyer HaKotan, even though it says Shnei Me'eres HaGdelim. So the Gemara answers that's after the Miyut. I would add that even before the moon was diminished, it was a different type of moyer than the sun. And we'll understand this more when we learn this tomorrow, hopefully. It's correct what you're saying. I'm agreeing, of course. Pasuk says it.
How would you argue that it's a different type of mirror than the sun? And what
The
basis
challenge
on?
here is, I have to read it again because these few lines are a little dense and not sure if he's referring to the sun or to the moon. Okay, we'll leave it for tomorrow. So I'm stopping here. We'll go over the parentheses again as many times until we get it figured out. So I'm stopping in the middle of page 1353. Any questions so far? Okay, we'll stop here.